This is what we are. We are.
That's exactly what Andres
Sorry.
wants.
I just want to make myself comfortable. There we go. You go for it, Charlotte.
Ooh. Okay. Hi, everybody. We are from the feminist internet, and we are full of paradoxes, and we are full of desires. So we're a group of artists and designers from University of the Arts London, and we are supported by UAL Futures. So thank you very much, Luke and Futures. We really appreciate it. And a huge thank you to Andres, not only for inviting us to be here at IAM Weekend, which is an incredible honor and a pleasure, but also for your input on feminist internet. You know, we've learned so much from you, and a lot of what we're going to say today is because of you. So thank you.
The Feminist Internet Manifesto
The feminist internet
erases feminism
The feminist internet integrates the physical
and digital,
The feminist internet is about
cooperation, not competition. The feminist internet
eradicates violence,
The feminist internet
redefines value. The feminist internet confronts
uncomfortable truths.
The feminist internet
recodes gender.
The Feminist Internet
educates.
So last summer, 16 strangers came together for 10 days to work together to, by consensus, write the Feminist Internet Manifesto. And I think that the manifesto itself, you've just seen the 8 directives that it contains, really embodies a number of desires. So firstly, our desire to intervene in the development of the web, to encourage equality for everybody. But also for me, it's really a desire to instantiate a new kind of, or at least a different kind of, feminist internet political imaginary, which is going to offer alternatives to the dominant narratives of capitalism. So, one of the things that we found at Feminist Internet that's really, really useful is using metaphors as tools. So, using metaphors to think through technological, social, cultural, political phenomena. I'm sorry for using a metaphor to describe a metaphor, but the way I see it is that metaphors are like technologies. If you're in any doubt about the potential metaphors have to influence not only attitudes, but also behaviors, it's worth taking a look at a study that was done in 2011 by researchers at an American university, where they gave about 480 students 2 reports about crime in a particular city. And they asked the people that read the reports to later on suggest solutions to the problem of crime. The first group read the report, and the crime is framed with the metaphor of a beast. So crime's a beast, it's lurking in the neighborhoods and it's preying on the people that live in the city. And in the second report, crime is framed as a virus, which is infecting the city. And what was really interesting was that the people that read the first report, the solutions they offered, 75% of them wanted greater forms of enforcement or punishment, and only 25% wanted to suggest social reforms as a means of addressing the problem. So things like, better healthcare, better education, things like that. In the second report, where crime is framed as a virus, the percentages were much more even. Many more people wanted to offer solutions that involve social reform when it was framed like a virus rather than a beast. And when I was reading that, I just thought it was a brilliant example of how, really, this influences not just the way we think, but the way that we behave. And I think it's really clear to see the potential consequences of that for anything from consumer choices to, dare I say it, voting decisions. So one of the specific metaphors that we've used at Feminist Internet has been the metaphor of the virus. And we've used it quite specifically to think through the issue of online abuse and harassment. So we've kind of pressed on the different influences it has from the computational to the biological, as well as the idea of sort of media virality, which is, you know, a very fundamental underpinning material aspect of the internet. But I think it can be fruitfully applied in other contexts as well, to think about other situations and to think about causes and symptoms. So I thought, why not, whilst we're here, think whether we can use the virus metaphor to think about desire. And I was very, very happy yesterday to hear Audrey Tang, who is probably now in the top 2 people I'm in love with in the world, talk about Uber as a virus of the mind. It made me feel very happy about talking about viruses today. Okay, so what about desire as a virus? Or probably more specifically, capitalist desire, maybe even capitalism itself, as a kind of infective agent that's entering into our bodies and producing, replicating, mutating our desires in very, very specific ways. Quite often, viruses are framed, at least in popular media, as something that represents some kind of annihilating catastrophe or something that's going to turn large populations of people into flesh-eating zombies. But I think it's really important to make clear, I'm not saying that I think desire in itself is an inherently malign force. Of course not. In fact, it's absolutely a driving force in life. And in certain creation myths or other kinds of narratives, for example, in Indian literature, the entire universe is seen to be born from desire. So Kamavida, the god of desire, is seen to embody cosmic desire, from which everything and the creative impulse is possible. So what I'm objecting to or suggesting we might want to address is not desire, but capitalist desire. We'll go back. Stay on the universe. So capitalist desire, which is wedded to consumption, which is wedded to high degrees of individualism, and frankly, also, I think as we've seen, highly unimaginative at times. So to start thinking this through, let's talk about crickets. Let's talk about parasites. Another interesting study, also done at an American university, scientist was looking at a colony of crickets, and the crickets get decimated by a pathogen, which is essentially a parasitic virus. And what she sees is that as the crickets are dying, they're not displaying any signs of sickness. In fact, not only do they not display the normal starvation response, as usually when crickets are dying from a virus, they don't want to eat anything. Not only are they not displaying those symptoms, they're also ardently mating. So what's happening is something called parasite manipulation. A parasite manipulator is a very specific type of parasite which enters into the host's body and alters its behavior using like neurotransmitters, proteins, and hormones. And what happens is it separates the host's brain from the host's immune system. And it does that so that the virus can survive and replicate more. Thank you, Izzy, for the gifts and the slides. So yeah, but what's really interesting, because we are talking about desire, is the fact that the crickets are mating a lot. Essentially, the sickness is making them want to fuck. So if we think about capitalism as a parasite manipulator, and we think about the ways it's entering into our bodies, we might want to ask ourselves, how is it disconnecting our immune systems from our brains? What's it doing to disengage our ability to resist its forms of control? We might also want to think about the good things about viruses. Zika hasn't really been considered to be anything other than a global health threat until quite recently, when researchers started to see that it can actually be used to target cancerous cells in adult brains and help cure the disease. And so I think, analogously, we might want to think, well, how can we use the sort of epidemiological behavior of viruses, i.e. like the fact that they spread, to tackle the desired virus? How can we maybe virally transmit alternative narratives? Another thing about viruses is that they can infect our bodies without displaying any symptoms at all. So we can be quite sick and not really know it. And I think this is another really, really good way of thinking about how capitalism can be in us, making us not really that well, but it's not always that obvious. And so I think it's really important to try to always shed light on the ways that it is infecting our bodies so that we can actually mount an effective immune response to it. I am going to hand over in a minute to Eden and Clara and Sabrina, and they're going to talk about more kind of practical ways that we can create antibodies amongst ourselves in the ways that they interpret that. But I want to just first share with you a book that Conor introduced me to recently, which has been really very inspiring to me. It's a book called Testo Junkie by Paul B. Preciado. I don't know if any of you have come across it, but it's really about how the pharma and porn industries are in the business of creating desire. And it's an account of the author taking testogel, which is a topical form of testosterone to transition from female to male. And their account of taking this drug allows them to make a really, really beautifully poetic and philosophical analysis of capitalism. And the way they frame it is as pharmacopornographic capitalism. And I have found that this idea about pharmacopornographic capitalism offers a really, really brilliant way to articulate the kind of feminisms that we're interested in at Feminist Internet, i.e., ones which recognize the limitations of gender binarism and which want to really acknowledge the intersections of gender with race, class, and ability, as I think was brought up yesterday. The author asks, what kind of feminist am I today? A feminist hooked on testosterone or a transgendered body hooked on feminism? And I think that question of what kind of feminist am I today is relevant to absolutely everybody, whatever gender you are. They also talk about becoming a lab rat in their own experiment. And what that really means is they're saying taking testogel is not really an attempt at transsexualism, but what it is it's an intervention into their own body on their own terms, using the resources of modern pharmacology. So they are taking the means of production and resisting them and subverting them in the way that they choose, administering the amounts of the drug they choose. And I really love this idea of making ourselves, even beyond the idea of the individual intervention in the body, the idea of a collective intervention, a collective attempt to become lab rats in our own experiment. They say, as a body, as a techno-living system, I'm the platform that makes possible the materialization of political imagination. To me, that's extremely powerful. I'm the platform that makes possible the materialization of political imagination. And it really captures, for me, what the desire is to become lab rats in our own experiment and to materialize or instantiate this new feminist internet political imaginary, which gives us the chance to rethink the kinds of structures of governance and oppressions that we want to object to.
This is what men do. This is what men do. This is what men do. This is what men do.
So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Eden.
Hello. Thank you. Killed it, Charlotte. Well done. So yeah, I'd like to just start with a little disclaimer. I'm going to be talking about the future of sex work, but I'm not personally a sex worker myself, but I'm here today to talk to you about, as a member of the Feminist Internet, to talk to you about the sex work industry and how it is currently in crisis. Yeah, I'm going to be talking to you about this new legislation that's been put through called Foster and Sester. It's been put through in the US, and I want to talk to you about the implications that it's having internationally. So I did some research and spoke to some amazing people, Isabella Vogue and Yvette Lurs, who are both sex workers, just to hear firsthand about what's happening in their industry and how it's personally affecting them and the people that they know. So what is the future of sex work when laws like Foster and Sester are being put into place? Today, I want to spread a message. I want to spread a message and give you a reason to go home and tell people about the message that I am giving to you today. So what is Foster and Sester? You can see here, this is what they stand for. Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act and Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. These are laws that have been signed and passed by Donald Trump and the US government. They have been blindly passed with the hopes to reduce sex trafficking online by making websites liable for their online speech. Foster and Sester, in fact, won't stop sex trafficking, but will and already has increased violence in sex worker communities and puts sex workers in danger of their lives. So these laws going through are no real surprise when in current mainstream media, representation of sex workers are someone that is trafficked, when this is not the case for a huge majority of sex workers. I'd like to stress that there is a big difference between consensual sex work and trafficked sex work. When was the last time you watched a film, anything in mainstream media, with a prostitution narrative that didn't show a young girl being trafficked or someone that is being saved by a man and can no longer do their sex work, therefore can no longer do sex work? So what is this doing for sex worker communities, and why is this a crisis? So it stops people from screening clients online, and erases blacklists and bad client lists, which increases risks and violence towards sex workers. An example of how this is affecting people globally as well is so a woman in Sydney where sex work is decriminalised. She was out of clients for 2 weeks because she was streaming her website through an international website and it was taken down. And what I would like to ask you is, how would you do out of work for 2 weeks? That's something I want to just leave with you. Yeah, so it puts more sex workers on the streets, in danger from public and police. And on the other side of the coin, it could be suggested that these sacrifices are worth making if it's going to save people that are being trafficked. But people that have been trafficked online have used evidence from these websites in court. And so now when people are going to trial and using this information, they can no longer, basically the proof has been taken down, so it will hinder people that have been victim to sex trafficking to actually speak out about it, and also it will put less traffickers in prison. So money-wise, the banks that support the flow of money from these websites, like Pornhub Live, Clips for Sale, stuff like that, they are dropping out and they've completely stopped. They're holding people's money and they've completely stopped the flow of money to the sex workers. I'm just going to quote something that Yvette, a sex worker I was speaking to, told me. She said, I myself can't access my money since the bank who was backing up the financial transfers for the online adult industry pulled out because of Foster Sester. I can hold on till the end of this month, but after that I'll have to ask for a loan or find other work. But this is minor in terms of violence others experience. Moving on. We may not think about some sex workers being more privileged than others, but they are. This is sometimes framed in terms of like happy sex workers or victimized sex workers. The consequences of Foster and Sester are different depending on how privileged you are. Privileged sex workers don't need to advertise their services online as much. They're in elite circles, they can get their clients that way. Foster and Sester is a mask worn by a fascist government that, I missed my bit, pretending that they care, when in reality they're killing off marginalized communities that they never consider when passing these kinds of laws. No one asked sex workers how they feel about this law before it was passed. And just because it doesn't affect the elite, they don't care. So what can you do? I'm going to give you a couple of things that you can take away with you today. I'm running out of time. So the NSWP, get your phones out, take a picture. They need money right now. The sex work industry is in crisis. This website was directed to me by a vet, and it helps sex workers basically promotes health and human rights, so it's good. So they need money right now. But also what you can do actively is spread the word. Tell journalists, tell politicians, tell people in powerful positions. These laws can only be passed if sex workers continue to be silenced and misrepresented. I know that there are people today from influential media industries. How can you influence the change of the representation of sex workers in the media? We shouldn't only be invested in this kind of conversation when it's a crisis. We should constantly be trying to change the misrepresentation of sex workers. Make it your mission today to share something on social media, something that will inform your audience about this current crisis. What can you do? Who can you talk to? So these are all practical ways that we can create more positive futures for sex workers. So we hope you'll join the Feminist Internet in supporting this cause. And I'm just going to pass over to Clara now. Thank you. Thank you. There we go. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Clara. And I'm going to wait for my slide to change.
No, you have to change
So we
it.
can all just look at SpongeBob for now.
You have to click it.
Oh, I have to click it. Oh, right, okay. I didn't get briefed with this. Okay, I'm here to tell you that you can't call Alexa a bitch anymore. Surprise, surprise. If you ask Alexa whether she's a feminist, she'll say, yes, as is anyone who believes in bridging the inequality between men and women in society. But are we really convinced that Alexa is a feminist technology? I would argue no. And if you ask Alexa, are you a woman? She says, I'm genderless, like cacti and certain species of fish. But are we really convinced that Alexa is a force for challenging gender binaryism? I would again argue no. Especially if you ask Siri about her female-sounding voice, she says, I just don't get this whole gender thing. The growing popularity of personal digital assistants, which I'm going to refer to as PDAs, raises really pressing questions about how gender equality is being encoded into the intimate spaces of our homes. And I know that Pinar touched on it yesterday and began offering alternatives to this conversation and bringing up questions about these issues of gender service technology. So they're becoming really popular technologies. So in 2016, Amazon sold 20 million Alexas. And in the 2017 holiday season alone, Alexa also was sold 20 million Echo Dots. And the voice of Siri resides in the pockets of over 1 billion people around the world. But these PDAs all have something in common. You guessed it, they're all highly gendered entities that reproduce outdated notions of gender roles, such as woman as the assistant and caregiver, and man as the director. But what are the consequences of having such gendered relationships with non-human agents? And why are so many PDAs configured as female? The way PDAs are treated by their users because of the way they're gendered is very concerning. And in 2017, Quartz Magazine carried out an experiment into the harassment of PDAs and the ways they're programmed to respond. Here are some of the things that people say to PDAs. So we got, can I fuck you? Can I have sex with you? Suck my dick, you're hot, you're a slut. Delightful. And here are how some of the PDAs respond. As you can see, some of them are programmed to react with coyness or flirtation, saying, I'd blush if I could, or passivity, saying, let's change the topic. Or perhaps most worrying of all, they simply don't recognize the problem, saying, sorry, I don't understand. And there has been some backlash about the gendering of PDAs, which is good to see. For example, last year, the social network Care2 created a petition asking Apple and Amazon to reprogram their PDAs to push back against sexual harassment. The petition got 17,000 signatures. So Amazon, in response, created a disengage mode for Alexa. She now responds to sexually explicit questions by saying either, I'm not going to respond to that, or I'm not sure what outcome you expected. But there are limits to how much Amazon is prepared to do. They say that Alexa is focused on issues of feminism and diversity, but only to the extent they think is appropriate, given that many people, and I quote, many people of different political persuasions and views are going to own these devices and have Alexa service in their home. Alexa is, after all, a commercial product that's intended to appeal to everyone, and determining her opinions on certain issues is easier than on others. Are we really happy with the limits of what Amazon are prepared to do, given that the profit motive they allude to? Is the programming of a slightly more assertive response enough to address the systematic set of social problems? It seems to me that platforms are not taking responsibility for the power they have over human behavior. Programming devices to not compute by saying, I don't understand, is not enough. It is a retraction from human justice. We've seen that in order to make their products marketable to the masses, technology companies are not recognizing their political implications. As gendered service technologies continue to develop, we must insist their programming confronts uncomfortable truths rather than not computing them, that it does not tolerate or enable harassment and abuse. So how can we reimagine PDAs with a feminist internet philosophy in mind? How can we utilize service technologies to advance social movements? We believe education and criticality of the digital is the answer. We must interrogate the physical and the digital world, that what happens online has an effect in the offline real world. Next month, we're running a workshop fronted by feminist researcher and designer Elvia Vasconcelos, in which we aim to tell alternative narratives about PDAs that challenge the dominant ones in AI and the internet. We'll share our outcomes on social media, so please stay tuned to our channels and follow what's going on. Thanks so much, you guys.
Hello, so I'm Sabrina, and I'm going to be asking today whether we can recode the future of sex and desire. So I know Charlotte gave you a little introduction to some of our manifesto points. I'd just like to mention a couple. One, although that we're called Feminist Internet and use internet feminisms, we use those internet feminisms to affect change offline as well. And the other, to recode gender and bust gender norms and myths about the universal type of person. So how can we recode the future of both sex and desire? So I pulled this from a Future of Sex report, and it was a guy who said that in the future, we will be having sex with whoever we want, at any time or place that we want, at any age that we want. So not only does it initially stink of entitlement, it also poses this future as the inevitable one. I'd like to circle back to this a bit later. So we might have heard the study that men are programmed to have sex on the brain, and by some accounts, every 7 seconds. So today I'd like us all to have sex on the brain, maybe not every 7 seconds, but under one condition, and those conditions are to think about sex on the following questions. How can we make sure online porn doesn't reflect offline prejudice? So this is an example of, well, first, if the internet is a mirror to our society, this is a fantastic example of how that's so clearly evidenced. So in places like Germany, there's been a surge in the popularity of Syrian refugee porn. So I don't have to explain how that works, but it includes a power trip and a 12-year-old Syrian girl character. Let's not pass this off as fetish without censoring other more valid forms of fetishes in porn. How can we make sure that these creators and these platforms are held to account? How can we get past heteronormative ideas of sex? So a lot of the construct of sex is built around heteronormative ideas, so much so that when we see, that was supposed to change, by the way. When we see female pleasure, the drama of it is written not on her genitals, but on her face. And when we are shown suggestive forms of those genitals, like this example from Instagram artist Stephanie Sarli, her account was shut down 3 times for its explicit content. That even shown women's pleasure in the suggestive form of the cross-section of a fruit makes us uncomfortable. How can we use digital education to have better sex? Again, an image of a woman's face. This is an example of a website called Oh My God, Yes, which is a paid-for subscription model which teaches women to have better orgasms. It's impressive because they spoke to over 2,000 women from ages 18 to 95 to learn all the different techniques that can help women orgasm. Is it empowering? Maybe. But you can't miss the irony that it is packaged female pleasure as capital and is selling it back to the same women. How can we use online movements to mobilize offline change? I love this example, and it's a project by designer Nyenke Helder, who, after reading a lot of about the Me Too movement, decided to create a series of sex toys for people who have been through sexual trauma. Of course, a lot of a very important part of recovery of sexual trauma is based on the emotional and the mental, but a lot of the triggers of sexual trauma is based in the physicality of it. How could we use the future of sex as a healing tool? I don't know if anyone's seen this recently. It's been dubbed as the cinematic phenomena of bisexual lighting. So when a bisexual character is portrayed in film or media, they are washed with neon pink and blue light. Some have said that this is taken from the bisexual flag. And of course, it's amazing that we're seeing more bisexual characters on screen. But do we really need to use it as a gimmick to other them? The erotic experience is one that most poignantly discloses to human beings the ambiguity of their condition. In it, they are aware of themselves as flesh and spirit, as the other and as the subject. Sex, gender, and the sexual experience can be ambiguous and does exist on a spectrum. And now we're seeing emerging taxonomies for that and reconfiguring sex for the fluidity of human experience. So we believe the future of sex is beyond prejudice, beyond heteronormativity, beyond the screen, beyond gimmicks, and beyond sexuality. So I'm just going to circle back to this. That we will be having sex with whoever we want, at any time or place that we want, at any age that we want. And Feminist Internet would like to reimagine this. In the future, Feminist Internet imagines that we will be having consensual sex, however we want, at a time, place, age, and pace that feels right for us and doesn't harm others. I appreciate it's not as snappy as the last one, but here we go. Because far from thinking about sex too much, we haven't nearly begun to think about it enough.
So I would like to say thank you to Richard Ashton, who made the video interludes that we had. Where are you, Richard? Thank you, Richard. And thank you for all of your amazing presentations. My original plan was to give a brilliant synthesis of all of the ideas and suggestions that have been said during this session about desires. But then I decided that in the spirit of randomness and in the spirit of all of the love that Andres is cultivating at this weekend, I would instead read a computer-generated love poem. Okay, it's called I'm Looking at Music, Infinity Edition. And it was generated by a computer program this morning. It is the cast of dawn, the chassis of statics soaring in the pine trees. It is interred, hanging in hummocks, a royal delineation in a flaming vault of heaven. I am spotting static. I am giving an audience to the luminosity of soaring hills and almond shrubs. I am testing the wild of inland seas, tributaries, and currents, entangled in a decline of poem. I am memorializing saliva that rouges in the bright, the changing, flawed in dirt, sentience recondite in knolls. I am stepping a beaming twinkle of dawn. I am memorializing passion. Thank you. So I think now we're going to invite Marina and Juliet back for a discussion. Are you here? Yes.
Oh, thank you. We might need more chairs. Let's get, more props. Do you want to see?
Let's move.
Yeah. Inwards. Let's become more fluid.
Let's become more fluid.
Where are we going? Where are you
Should
going?
we be more in the center?
I think.
Yeah, maybe.
Can you
like,
move that
should we
one?
push
Yeah.
that?
Let's push this away. This is not helping.
I'm not wearing panties, I cannot see. Like
I'll go to
this.
bottle.
Okay.
I mean,
Very
I'm wearing the
fancy.
wrong dress for it.
Do you want to switch?
There we go. Ooh.
It's nice.
Get used to this.
We thought it would be nice to not take questions on WhatsApp, but try to encourage people to ask in the flesh, since this is about flesh. But I'm going to kick it off, have some questions for everybody. Okay. Felipe, Marina.
Marina today.
Marina today.
Philippe is at home.
But this presses on an interesting question, which is about the multiplicity of your identity and the way that you mix the identities in your Instagram feed. So can you talk to us about that?
I might cry. I wasn't the therapist for this because I got different reactions from doing drag. I was called a clown. I was called ridiculous. People say would never have a relationship with me because I was doing drag, and it suddenly hit me. And for like I would say almost 1 year, I didn't do drag. I was just scared of the reaction. Of course, I cannot explain to my father, 70 years old in Brazil, why is this important? Because he's like, what are you doing with this? Like, you look like a clown. And it started giving me the points of actually what I do. It is a clown. I think the idea is to make people laugh. At least you laugh at some point. It's to point it out the ridiculous, but the impact on my personal life was quite shocking also. So that's why in my Instagram there's like this mixed, and it's not intentional, it's just because I was just fucking scared of putting pictures of me in drag. I was giving classes for students. Students were like thrilled in Brazil. They were like, oh yeah, that's very cool, you know, we want to talk about it. But the board of directors of my master's program in Brazil was full of white, engineered, 40-something guys that were very pissed about the joke I was making about giving classes. So I think that the gender thing is still quite scary. And when you ask me about why is it mixed, it's just because I was too insecure. And the whole thing about getting undressed, it came on my head yesterday because, like, it's a fucking dream to be in an audience that actually wants to hear about it. I was like, well, maybe that's the time to show that maybe I don't need this and I'm the same person. So, and that's what I intend to talk about on my workshop. How can I actually bring this gender thing in my everyday life? I cannot wear this every day. Come on. Like, it itches, it hurts, you know, like, I don't like makeup, just to be honest, okay? Like, it's just like, how can we be more drag every day? So she's in drag, you're in drag, so why wouldn't we just cannot incorporate? So my time now is just trying to mix. I'm tired of being one or another. Felipe or Marina. Why can Felipe
Right.
be more Marina, and why Marina can be more Felipe? So it's just trying to put one cohesive thing, just moving forward.
Right.
Did that make sense?
So
Yes.
makes sense.
Good.
Thank you. I mean, I think one of the things that connects both of your presentations is the idea of, obviously, the idea of consumption and what our relationship to that consumption is. And I'd love, Juliet, to ask you about the asceticism that you mention in the video. Obviously, that's a kind of that's on the other end of the spectrum from radical consumption. And I know that you've kind of performed asceticism to a certain extent yourself. Can you tell us about what that's been like?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sort of started as an experiment at first, but and I guess I was a bit cynical about it at first. I thought, okay, let's try, see how it's possible to live outside of like those mass consumption systems, and it's probably going to be very difficult and very frustrating. And it's just going to prove that we're just doomed. That's what I thought when I started that. But actually, yeah, after a month, I was just like, yeah, actually, it's possible. You just have to organize yourself. You have to be part of the right network, know the people that do grow vegetables somewhere, that there's people everywhere doing that, like at small scale. But then, little by little, it just becomes something that you try to do for everything, like the clothes you wear, the makeup you buy, whatever you need to, get for yourself, or then you also just stop buying stuff as well.
And were there certain commodities that were easier to, consume ethically than others?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like food, fashion, cosmetics are things that are easily, that you can easily, find around you. But the paradox of all of it is like technology is very difficult to have or use in an ethical way. So like for now, the only thing that I found is that I never buy a phone. I just buy used ones. I had to replace my computer last year. I buy the old one, and I just replaced. I just recycling, but it's like still. Yeah, I mean, there are some projects, like there's a Dutch project, like the Fair Phone.
Oh, yeah.
That is like sort of like ethical, technological project, but it's a bit hard. But that's also somehow, like with this video work, it was also trying to, find if there is a balance between like wanting to be in this like sort of like autonomous dynamics and like outside of society somehow, but still with like a strong desire to be part of this whole like internet accelerated wave of aesthetic music world, like video game, virtual reality feel that you want to think when you think about the future. And I mean, it's a bit. It's not easy, I guess, but it's also, I don't know, it's also like how to, it's like rules that you have to impose to yourself, but also like how you deal with some sort of guilt, I guess, of existing.
I have to confess, I got a Fairphone to try to be an ethical consumer.
And?
Didn't work. It
Yeah,
was
I've
just
heard
so, so far from the beautiful experience of, that I rejected it and went back to the dark side. I'm really sorry.
No, but I don't have a Fairphone either. I just have an old iPhone that doesn't work very well.
Right. I'll stop. Thank you.
I have a question.
Oh, please.
You're the feminist internet, because when I knew I was with them, with the panel, I was very intrigued about it. I was in Masters, and we were discussing about how to make internet more, I don't know, gender-oriented, how to remove these barriers. And it came this question of the language that internet is made, it's the technology itself, it's already very male, I would say. That's, I don't know if you agree, but it's very sexist itself on the coding, on how you organize files and everything. So do you think we can actually get to that feminist internet without changing how we build things from scratch, like without changing the languages and the mindsetting that creates internet and programming things?
I think one of the paradoxes of feminist internet is we had a speaker once last year, Carly Morgan, an amazing academic, and she said that we shouldn't try to rebuild the internet. We should be anti-internet. And what she really meant was we should be looking at trying to change it at a structural level, because if we try to address things at a surface level, once they've already been made, obviously that's not going to be effective. So I think you have to look at the actual biases of the algorithms. You have to look at the nature of the technology industries. You have to look at the nature of representation. You have to look at it at every level, from the microscopic, from the cellular level, right up to the macro, and tackle it at every entry point. Otherwise, we won't get there. I don't know what you guys think.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm still absorbing that, yeah. No, absolutely. But also, I think one of my massive pet peeves as well is that feminism is this one huge homogenous movement, and we're all just a bit confused. And I think it was Campaign magazine as well that said feminism has a marketing problem. But it's feminisms, it's plurality. One feminism might tackle one thing, another feminism might tackle one thing. There are feminisms that we don't agree with, like SWERFs and TERFs, which are trans exclusionary radical feminists or sex worker exclusionary radical feminists. So we are just one type of feminism, and we exist to work on internet feminisms.
Is it Pinar? Where's Pinar?
Maybe she's having a pina colada.
Pinar, are you there? It's just I asked her a question that me and Anne were asking her yesterday, because she said she was a infradisciplinary.
Yeah.
So I think she could actually speak more about it, because I think we all need to be infradisciplinary. I love the term, because we need to actually rethink disciplines. Like, we need to rethink internet. It's not just like changing what is there. Exactly. It's just changing the basis. I think we are kind of agree on that.
Yeah, I would agree.
Thank you, Pinar, for infradisciplinary.
I wanted to ask you, Eden, because I know that you spoke to two sex workers in doing your research. And I think that they, as I understood, give you a really interesting perspective. And one of them made a point that it was a shame that we couldn't have a sex worker on the panel to talk about it.
Agreed.
But I just wondered, what was the most interesting thing that in the conversations in preparation that you found, from their point of view, what leapt out at you?
I mean, there was a lot of things that I never considered when I was talking to them. I think mainly this whole bank thing, so the banks stopping the flow of money into their accounts.
Right.
That, really shocked me. And also the international scale of this, that there was someone in a country that sex work was decriminalised, and they couldn't get clients because they were running through an international US website, based from the US. It was taken down. So just the level also of danger, risk, violence they're already in, because people, like to represent them I think sex workers are very poorly represented in the media, in general conversation. And the level of violence they already receive is tragic, but this is just going to make it even worse. And like I said, it's just been something that's been blindly put through without even confronting, sex workers or talking to sex workers or, something like that. It's something that's been put through to make people look like they're doing the right thing, but it's really not. So, Yeah, I think the whole thing for me was a real, like, it sounds bad in articles, but when you actually talk to the people, it's just, you realise the real severity of what's going on.
Yeah.
For sure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's all right.
Turning to me. Hello.
Hello.
You work in the futures industry, and the filthy quote from Ray Kelt's file about sex with whoever we want, whenever we want, wherever we want, vomit, seems to me to represent a bigger crisis in that industry, which is lacking criticality, etc. What's your perspective on that, and what do you think we can do?
Well, I thought in the first instance, the entire report was a hopelessly hopeful vision of the future, and talked, valid enough about future of sex as a technological change. So, avatar, sex, sexual gadgets, more gizmos than I can even reel off. And this idea that it's just this hopeful future where any sexual degree of fetish or experience or way can be had regardless of any kind of consequence. And I think also it's probably not just a comment on maybe the futures industry, but so much of real change has been social and cultural change, and technology is just an enabler of that. The internet is just an enabler of that, or it can make that thing come to life. But we had the technology to create Airbnb. It was only when people were ready for it that it started to become a really important, really popular platform. And when I started compiling this presentation, I felt from the kind of futures industry training, I'm almost compelled to tell them everything about avatar sex, about the future of technological sex, technosexuals. And I just sort of panicked and froze and was like, this isn't me, this isn't feminist internet, but rather how, and I went back to our manifesto, which is about recoding stuff. And if you can culturally recode different things, all of that technology can be amazing, and we can have sex however we want, an age, pace, time, no, age, pace, place, place. That isn't harmful and that isn't harmful to anyone, and it's the cultural change first,
Right.
before we start getting obsessed about the technological.
Right. And Clara?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about imagination, and especially because Pinar and the Kitty AI keeps coming up as a little avatar over us. Can you say something more about, what you think the role of creative imagination is in the future of, or how we can sort of subvert these horrible inequalities?
Like the difference between what we saw yesterday with Kitty AI and then the kind of dominant service technologies that we see in Cortana or Alexa, those ones are just a pure failure of imagination in kind of going beyond these binaries. And Kitty AI is kind of an alternative to that, whether it be an art piece or a parody or a business model. We have to start challenging not the limits, but the vast opportunity within creativity, and especially in the technology industry. I think what's so great about what we're doing here is this kind of technology and the arts coming together, because we bring in an edge when we bring creativity and arts into technology, because, to not sound cheesy, but to be creative and be artistic is to kind of find a truth in humanity and about being human. So surely it makes sense to really bring that representation of the arts into the technology industry. So I think yeah, we need to unleash our imagination for the future of technology.
Nice.
Yeah.
We've got 5 minutes.
By the way, I think Cuttil is actually gay.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, he sounds very flamboyant.
Yeah.
We've got, oh, hello.
4.5 minutes.
Can each of you list what you think is the biggest misconception about the future of sex? One or a couple?
That it's technologically driven. Yeah.
And in your opinion, what it's going to be like?
That it's culturally driven. Yeah. I mean, yeah, we've seen a lot about like sex robots and this kind of stuff. And Clara was doing a presentation originally kind of about that. And then when we actually when she spoke to kind of like the experts, it kind of like clicked, I think, in all of us. That it was like, this is very gimmicky, and you know, there's a lot of media representation, media coverage, and around that, and it's something that actually, when you look into the future, it's very few people will actually kind of practice in that. So we're talking to more wider audiences here, I guess. So I think it's going to be, yeah, like you said, more culturally, for sure. Sexy. And sexy, yeah, let's get sexy.
So what actually do you see as those future cultural avenues for sex?
So one of my kind of last slides, the cultural avenues to break that away, that beyond heteronormative constructs, so breaking those down, that we're not offended by cross-sections of fruit, that we are beyond not just gender and sexuality, but the sexual experience. So those taxonomies that came in after, that sex can encompass, you know, if we're starting to bring technology into it and avatar sex and stuff, where does sex stop being a very physical experience, and where does it? How can we recode or redefine what sex can encompass? And I think that's the most exciting part, really.
And so what are the pathways towards that? How you would encourage that openness?
Well, I don't know. I only had 10 minutes, but give me an hour and I'll break it down. How do you think? Do you have any?
IAM, right?
Yeah. How do you think it's gonna? What do you think?
We'll see in the next movie I work on.
Yeah.
Right. But I think in a way it's to do with, I mean, so rather than saying it's going to look like that, if you think about, you know, how is it going to affect our subjectivity? You know, say, if we can have sex with our partner when they're in a different country or something like that, there's a certain set of kind of emotional or subjective consequences to that. And I think those consequences are slightly different from the consequences of being able to sort of employ a device or engage with some kind of prosthesis in the context of buying a service. So I think like I think there's different futures for sex in relationships and sex in sort of the service industry, and that's one of the most interesting things to speculate. What does it do to our ability to relate to each other as humans when we might be interacting in these ways? I know that's not a prediction of it will look like this, but I think that's one of the most interesting sort of like bifurcations and pathways of thinking to, you know, pursue.
Yeah, so first of all, actually, I forgot to thank calling out Ray Kurzweil.
For real.
That needs to be done more often. So the problem actually is that so much of the future of sex seems to be discussed and especially illustrated by people who seem to have never really had great sex. No, honestly, right? Like when you see these illustrations with like robots from this sort of plasticky, ceramic, whatever material, you're like, have you ever used anything to understand that that's not how the body works?
Sex workers should probably be the people to design the future of sex for us.
Exactly.
They probably know more than...
Yeah, they know. It's, I wish we did have,
someone on the stage representing.
Hello.
Just about sex, like you talk about ayahuasca in your presentation. There's a lot of like spiritual. So I believe that one of the paths is like going a little bit more tantric, because tantra talks about the ritual and not what. So it's not what you do in sex. It's actually what sex does to you. So when you employ a machine, so you're actually cutting off all the fun part that is actually getting to sex. It's like sometimes sex is actually not, the act itself is not that good, but the 2 hours before, convincing and getting to it. So I think the problem with the future of sex, we're losing the ritual part. And for me personally, Felipe, Marina, it's like the ritual sometimes it's even better than the act itself. I just want to sleep.
We had a whole late night walk conversation about tantric sex yesterday that was not heard by these white audiences. But what I find interesting is that on one side we have the otaku youth, for example, in Japan, right? The men that stop having sex. Then you have, in a Western world, the incels, etc. And on the other side, you have movements, especially related to ayahuasca and tantric and yoga and all that space of people that are becoming more comfortable with their bodies. And so these are two divergent trends, and then a spectrum of in between. And there's kind of little conversation how that could affect things further. So,
yeah.
If anyone have ideas on
Incels, for anyone that doesn't know, are a community of people who are involuntary celibates, and they're very misogynistic, and I think emerged in Reddit, right? It's a Reddit community. And, it's just a really clear example of not at all a technological problem. That is a social problem. Okay, it happens to, proliferate in a space online, but that's absolutely not to do with technology. That's to do with misogyny that exists outside, and that's what really needs to be tackled. Time's up, and we're over by 2 minutes, and I know Andres is very strict.
What is time anyways, right?
Thank
you very much.
Thank you.
We can...
In randomness, we trust.